Huh?
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, featuring your hosts, Taylor Field and Reuben Olson.
Hey everyone, you're listening to a new episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host Taylor, and we got a really awesome discussion today that we're going to be going over. This is unique because, again, Reuben is not here for this episode, so it won't be a back and forth compiling notes kind of take. And it's not necessarily an encounters episode where I'm bringing someone on the show to discuss, but I've reached out to an individual and they have granted me permission to disclose their story on this episode of Cryptid Clues because they had a truly incredible experience and it hit me. I really wanted to discuss it, and I'm so happy that they agreed to let me use it in this episode. So I'm going to quote unquote repeat the encounter to the best of my ability. And then I had given them a few questions, which I will provide the answers for. And then I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about this. So before we get into that, though, a couple plugs. Just want to shout out, if you want to check out our website for any more information, we're at CryptidClues.ca. And you can also find us on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook at Cryptid Clues. And if you want to just send an email and reach out to us, just say hello, see how things are going, CryptidClues@gmail.com is how you can reach us. Now, please note that email, because through this episode, if you feel like you have had an experience that has any kind of similarities to the events that I will be discussing here, or if you feel like you've even witnessed something that falls kind of into line of what we're going to talk about in the description of this character, then please reach out. I'd love to hear from you. I know I would be happy to pass this information along to, again, the individual that has allowed me to use this experience in this episode. So it would mean a lot. So without further ado, we're going to dive into this, and I'm going to quote exactly word for word the experience as it was written out. Was it just a dream? I've struggled with the idea of sharing my experience, mostly because I don't know if it actually happened or if it was just a dream. One night in the summer, when I was about 10 or 11, I was awake in the middle of the night, and I could hear the horses running around the pasture as if something had happened. I decided to get up and go check on things. At that time, my family had a massive old barn, and we lived in the middle of nowhere. I walked through the door of the barn and found a very large man, as white as snow, climbing into the hayloft. I remember being startled, but not scared. He turned around and looked at me, and slowly lowered himself back down. He took a few steps towards before he knelt down and put out his hand, like one would do with a stray animal. As I looked at him, I felt like he looked sad and tired, and not at all like he would do me any harm. I decided to take his hand and walk him towards our kids' hangout space, which was just a space in the barn where we had some old couches, a few toys, and a radio. As soon as he saw the radio, he became more animated, ran towards it, and started messing around with it. That went on for a bit, and I kept asking him what he needed the radio for. He never said a word, not one word. He wouldn't give me a name, so I started calling him Radio. After some time, he sat the radio down and sat down on the couch. I brought over my favorite horse book and started thumbing through the pages, showing him all of my favorite horse breeds. Eventually, he gently took the book from me and closed it, as if to say, "I'm done." I got up to put the book away, and he laid down on the couch. I remember him being so large that his head was on the armrest while his legs hung over the other armrest at the knee. He was a giant, pure white, and I don't recall any hair. His eyes were jet black, but they weren't huge or angular. If anything, they slanted downward and were beady. After he fell asleep, I decided to go back in the house and go to bed. But I put a blanket over him before I went in. I woke up in the morning and the whole experience came flooding back to me. My feet were dirty as if I had been outside during the night. I grabbed some snacks and I ran out to the barn. I ran to our hangout space and found everything as I would have expected it. The blanket was on the floor, the book was sitting on the table, and radio was out of place. But he was gone. It's important to know that I had a bit of a habit of sleepwalking at this time in my life. So it's possible that this was all just a dream. At first, I thought he was just a very, very, very strange person, and I hoped he found safety. The memory never left me, and by the time I was a teen, I had decided that I had dreamed the whole thing and let it go. Then, Prometheus came out, and I agreed to go see it with friends. When the tall white alien came on screen, I nearly jumped out of my seat. It wasn't an exact likeness, but it was like seeing a ghost. At the time, I knew absolutely nothing about aliens, and the only one I had ever heard of was the classic little green men. Nonetheless, I forced myself to let it go and move on. That memory could not be real, so I must have dreamed it. As time passed, I started wondering how I could have imagined a being that I had never heard of. Could that have really happened? Could radio be real? And that is the experience that this individual had with radio. I will probably say this again, but at this time, one of the biggest things that pulled me into wanting to do an episode about this experience was how humble it was. It's very simple, and it doesn't have like driving down the road and something just comes out and like maybe swipes the side of your vehicle, or you see dozens of UFOs in the sky, or you see dozens of cryptids crawling out of the tree line. It's a very down-to-earth, humble, and simple experience. And to me, those are the kinds of things that, at least to me, it made me feel really grounded. It made me feel very positive, and to a very strong degree, very believable. I think that not everything out there is trying to come at us and cause us pain or harm. In this experience, the way I interpret this is you have this weary traveler, radio, who is making his way. We don't know his past. We don't know his future. We're learning his present. And his present at this time is he is a weary, exhausted individual who's presented with, I don't want to say a brief beacon of hope, but a moment of reprieve. And in this moment of reprieve, it is met with the most sincerest respect, and a scenario where two very different beings form this mutual bonding, I don't want to say relationship, but connected moment. And I just found it to be extremely powerful. So when I go into the questions, now, these questions were things I had thought up, and I'd done a little bit of research, and I was just curious and thinking like, okay, I wonder more about this scenario and this scenario. So the questions are as follows. The horses that were running around, obviously this individual heard them. I was curious if it was more out of fear or more startled, as I know horses can be quite 1 to 100. But the response, again, I very much appreciate, and if you are listening to this, your responses were absolutely 10 out of 10. I couldn't be more happy just to have been having this great conversation with you and getting these responses. And you had told me, again, the horses are prey animals. So when anything is out of the ordinary, they are inclined to run. They did snort a few times, which would imply fear, though they settled back down after a few minutes, which would imply they had just been startled. So simply put, I think they were scared, but quickly realized they weren't in danger. And that's quote unquote. So these answers I'm going to be quoting directly from the responses that I was given by this individual. So my next question, when you saw radio and got startled, did radio display any notion of being startled as well? I don't recall a sense of him being startled. As an adult, I best relate his body language to a feeling of, oh shit, you're not supposed to be here. I don't think he wanted to deal with me, but he wasn't afraid of me. I then asked, was radio clothed in any garb? And I was curious about this because when he mentioned the Prometheus, now those individuals, those aliens, obviously we see one just wearing basically a loincloth. And then obviously there's space suits later on. But I was curious if there was anything like a skin tight suit, because I know in previous episodes and on discussions with Reuben, we do talk about that kind of thing. Again, like skin, what does it look like, everything. And it's just one of those signs that can kind of help pinpoint and narrow down something in this experience that possibly someone else can relate to. Now, the response was, I don't recall any clothing at all. So it just makes me wonder again more about the anatomy and just how this individual was faring and what happened to them specifically. I then proceed to ask, you mentioned that you felt a sense of sadness and exhaustion upon meeting Radio. Was there anything visually that prompted such sense, or was it purely the energy that Radio was emanating? In response, I've never really thought about it. I remember feeling it so strongly, and my knee-jerk reaction would be to say that he looked sad and tired. But as I think back on that moment, I don't remember any clear facial expressions. I do remember, though, his body felt almost slumped as he got down on one knee. That is something that really, really just, it hit me hard when going through this experience and reading over it and going through these answers. Again, it just adds to this weary traveler who's just, in this present moment, exhausted. After bringing Radio to the hangout area and the individual's attention became fixated on the radio device itself, was the radio functional and plugged in, or just unplugged and used for fun? Yep, it was plugged in and functioning radio. He was messing with the dials. As a child, I thought he was just looking for a good station, but now I wonder if it was a way of making contact with others. Again, this is one of the most fascinating points of the story. Everything that's just around Radio, resulting in him being not very animated, not very mobile, but this one thing, something again that would be a beacon of light for anyone, I think, in this case scenario. If you're stranded in an area you're unfamiliar with, but you see a device that could be a source or tool that calls home, and I'll definitely reference something along the lines of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. It just seems like it's just a hand-in-hand kind of scenario, and I think that him being much more animated, like was mentioned in the story, I think it really goes to show the beacon of hope that stemmed from this. And I wondered as well if when he becomes more relaxed afterwards, did he actually do something? Again, without actually knowing exactly what he did by turning a few dials or whatnot, it's hard to say, but I do wonder if maybe there was a station he could have turned to. Maybe there was something that he had clipped in with it, done something, even with his mind, perhaps. There's so many questions that could kind of connect with that I didn't want to bombard and overload. I just wanted to keep it as a simple question, but it's just more so kind of where my mind has been going with this, kind of has been running with this idea of how, I guess I'd say, exciting it is, where there was this device, he identified with it, and knew exactly what he wanted to try and do with it. And to me, that is just incredible. My next question was, did you feel a change in his energy after he stopped with the radio? And again, when you started showing him the horse book? The response that I received was, after putting the radio down, he seemed to return to what I would think of as his baseline. Not very animated, slow, steady movement, a lot of looking around, scanning the environment around him. He would look at the book, but he didn't seem terribly interested in it. Again, I feel like this is a way of just keeping the situation calm and just kind of working with the environment that's presented and the situation presented to him. I do feel like, in retrospect of what I had said in relation to the previous question, that there is some sort of calm, relaxing sense that perhaps he did do something with that radio, and now he was at a moment where he could just be calm and not necessarily monotone, but more relaxed, and just kind of embrace and accept with the surroundings of what is going on, not cause any alarm or distress that could create a serious rift in what was going on. Again, it is impossible to say how or what his methods are of communication with any other individuals that are of the same lineage of radio, but I imagine that based on where the outcome of the story goes, either him leaving or being rescued, that he's being calm, he's succeeded in what he was trying to do, he found something that could help him on this journey, and now he's just resting. Now, another thing I wanted to note and I had asked as one of the questions was, throughout this experience, Radio's use of his hands was basically a form of communication as opposed to speaking. And I say this in reference to when they had first encountered each other, and he had, being Radio, lowered himself back down and basically reached his hand out. And it was almost using that as his form of communication, along with a lot of his body language. I found that very interesting. And so I was inquiring, did you feel as if Radio could speak if chosen to? The answer I had received was he had a mouth, so maybe. But no, I got the sense that he couldn't speak. I feel like if he could have, he would have at least made some noise. I don't even recall a grunt or a grumble. Again, it just makes me think along the lines of maybe it's just a heightened sense of mental capabilities. But I'm not an expert on that sort of thing or necessarily how one's evolution or body might change and develop, in the sense where if you form much more of a stronger mental ability and connection, you probably would lose such things as, vocal chamber, vocal cord, a mouth, all those kinds of things in favor of these other senses that develop. But, of course, I'm not an expert on that. That is just my own perspective and thought on that. The next question that I asked, when Radio laid on the couch, was it a love seat or a 3-seat cushion couch? I was really curious on this because this helps kind of figure out and confirm his actual height a little bit more. So it was a standard 3-seater. So just for a little bit of context, standard 3-cushion sofas have a length of just over 7 feet. So this would put him beyond that in height in regards to, in the story, his head and knees passing both of the armrests. Now, love seats, of course, have a standard length of 5.5 feet, usually from armrest to armrest. So this being a 3-seater, this confirms and puts him being quite a tall individual. My next question, when Radio began to rest, there was no sign of further interaction with you, or no hesitation to rest while you stood there? Did Radio's eyes close when he went to sleep, or did they remain open? And I wanted to ask this kind of in retrospect with the previous questions, in sorts of wondering why he was kind of resting and more calm, and kind of segueing into more of what he looked like and his mannerisms. So in response, I got, there was no further interaction after he laid down. I say laid down because yes, his eyes did close, but I sometimes wonder if he was playing possum. Like, if he's asleep, I'll stop bothering him, It really all comes back to this feeling of whatever he was doing there, I was a big old wrench in the wheel, but he couldn't have me causing a scene. For all I know, he wasn't really sleeping, though he seemed like he was, and he left as soon as I went in the house. Now, again, I feel like this could go one of two ways. As we talked about before, he could have done something to that radio and actually used it to send out a beacon or something, or synced up with his mental capabilities to some degree, or it just simply wasn't what he was looking for. And when the next day rolled around, he did just leave and go back out into the wild. It's really anybody's guess. I then proceeded to ask, from your experience, this seems to be the moment where you really got to observe what Radio looked like. Skin color, facial features, no hair. With the eyes, however, was the iris pupil all jet black with white around, or was the entire eye black itself? Also, did you notice if Radio had any ears, human like ours? So I actually got a photo back, and this photo, which I'll put on the blog onto the Cryptid Clues website, it's basically exactly the Prometheans, engineers, I guess, from Alien Prometheus, the movie that was mentioned in the story. And it just seems like a larger humanoid giant, just spot on like what this character was in this movie. So the guy in the movie that nearly had me jump out of my seat, again, not an exact likeness, but so familiar it was like seeing a ghost. I remember his mouth being broader than this and the eyes slanting more downward. Also, he had ears, but they were much smaller. That is what the answer that I had received. So again, this will be posted onto the blog so you can kind of see much more of like a photograph as evidence. What made you decide to put a blanket over radio before leaving? This, I was just very curious. I found this again to be an extremely humbling moment. Response being, I'm not sure. Habit, I suppose. I still throw a blanket over someone if they're sleeping. And again, just very humbling. Your parents didn't notice you leaving or returning to the house at this time of night, did they? In response, they did not notice me coming or going, though they did acknowledge I must have been in the barn. I found that, again, very interesting, but it just makes me wonder a little bit more what the parents kind of had in the back of their minds. Again, if someone is sleepwalking, and it's a common occurrence, I've never been caught sleepwalking before, but I segue this into my next question. The mention of sleepwalking, was this a common nightly occurrence for you at this time? Did you ever go outside or to the barn while sleepwalking before? In response, definitely not a nightly occurrence, but it did happen from time to time. I usually wake up in the bathtub though. I did have one instance of going out to the barn. The difference was that when I would sleepwalk, I would wake up in a different place and have absolutely no recollection of how I got there. On the night of my experience, I remember everything, and I ended up back in my bed. While I can't rule out sleepwalking for this particular night, it didn't follow the normal patterns. So as a follow-up to that question, I pitched out, was there any time throughout this experience that you don't remember? In short, missing time. And I like the response, not that I remember. No kidding. No, I don't believe any time was lost. And again, that's just something to kind of pair up with the general outline of how sleepwalking worked for this individual, how he would just end up in different places and have no recollection. I then asked, did you notice anything out of the ordinary above? Lights or noises in the sky? And this is something in relation to, again, a lot of these kind of experiences can sometimes have, floating orbs, lights, anything that's just very abnormal that you might catch. There's stories of people walking out, and this is where missing time comes into play. They'll see something in the sky, lights, all in a formation or a little bit of a cluster. And it'll be hours that have passed for them without any reason of recollection to follow up on. So I just was curious. But however, in response, I don't recall any lights or strange noises. So it just goes again to this idea that I have kind of developed of this weary traveler. I then asked, how did your parents react to your experience with radio when you told them? In response, I made it as far as telling them that there had been a giant in the barn before they told me this was just a dream. Nonetheless, my dad checked the barn, and I got the old parental lecture of don't go outside at night in case I hadn't been sleepwalking. It made me second guess myself, and I decided I needed to let it go. Again, I'm going to try and put myself in these shoes. If I was a parent and my child had experienced something along these lines, now I am very prone already to this kind of thing and very open to it, and I would be flabbergasted if my child said this. But in this case scenario, I would probably have a degree of fear of the uncertainty, the unknowing, that would cause me to want to dismiss this, check it out, make sure everything is fine, make sure my child is safe, my family is okay, animals are safe and sound, everything is okay and squared away. So once that is all taken care of, then I believe it would just be a matter of dismissing it and just letting it be swept under the rug and hoping it just never reoccurs again. And that does seem to be the case here. So in closing, just my overall thoughts are, movies can be exceptionally scary. The concepts and source material stems from some branch of thought or experience, whether that be real or not. I say this as well because when you look at the individual that I interviewed, their story, their experience, they didn't have any pre-existing baseline or imagery to go to and defer to, especially upon waking up for this entire scenario. Aside from Little Green Men, this was something that was fabricated that either was implanted in their mind or really happened. And when they seen this thing in the movie Prometheus, it's flabbergasting because that's just a crazy scenario to see something on the big screen that you can identify with, you can relate to, you can go, I saw that. And I think there's a lot of movies that come out these days that actually have that happen to a lot of people. It can be in the form of deja vu, it can be in the form of a memory, and it's truly mind-blowing. On this story, could radio share a connection to tall whites? That was something that I was primarily deferring to. Now, with tall whites, they have, it seems like a variety of different, physical attributes, aesthetics. The eyes was something I was particularly looking into the most because it seems like with this story, and then using the template of the creatures from Prometheus as kind of a baseline, it seems like there are still multiple differences. But again, I'm not the kind of person to dismiss multiple types of otherworldly humanoids at all. So his interest in the radio, however, certainly instigates a sense of being technologically savvy and aware. And I like that aspect because, again, it's not just something like, I'm not going to go ahead and say, your Dogman or your Bigfoot or anything like that is not technologically savvy. That's a whole other conversation on its own. But on this front, he identified it, and he almost seemed like he knew what he could do to it and do with it. But the technology probably was inhibited or limited by its capabilities. But to conclude all of this, how can you create a memory using entities and imagery you have never heard of or witnessed? Where do these things come from if your brain hasn't interacted with it? 99.9% of all these things could be completely fake, but there is always that 0.1% chance. And that's all the reason I need to believe. Not only is this individual's experience humbling, but it shows our desire to help as a species. It shows that we can be truly kind and be so much more than, at least to me, what I feel like what we can be. We can be absolutely incredible. The open-mindedness of a child, seeing something that would send others running in a panic. A child sees despair and attempts to bring comfort and peace. Shares something that the child holds dear to themselves. Now, while caution should always be exercised when in the presence of the unknown, be sure to always trust your instincts, your feelings, be respectful, and know that you are not alone. If you or anyone you know has had an experience similar to this, bearing witness to something similar to radio, please, it would mean the world if you reached out. Again, it would be 100% confidential, but I would just like to try and connect the dot and just even go to the individual I was able to interview for this story, which I can't thank enough for them taking the time to respond to my questions and giving me permission to actually post this story in a podcast episode. It is absolutely incredible. And I hope that we can kind of create a little bit of an archive here and see if there are more individuals like radio out there and if other people have had experiences like this. And with that, that is where I'll end this episode. So I hope you enjoyed it. Again, you can find us at CryptidClues.ca is our home base. Cryptid Clues on Twitter and Facebook. And you can also find us CryptidClues@gmail.com. So until next time, I'm Taylor. Have a good one, everybody.